Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a geopolitical standoff so massive, its shadow literally still falls across our modern world. For over a century, the British and Russian empires basically stared each other down across the mountains and deserts of Central Asia. This is the Great Game.
Okay, let's jump right in by asking, what exactly was the Great Game? Think about how a rivalry defined by profound distrust, elaborate espionage, and brutal proxy wars somehow managed to redraw the entire map of the world, all without ever erupting into a direct, full-scale war between British and Russian colonial armies. It was essentially a Cold War, played out in the 19th century, serving as a high-stakes competition over vast territories that stretched all the way from the Caspian Sea to the eastern Himalayas.
To the folks actually playing it, this era was like an intense game of geopolitical chess. In fact, the term itself was coined back in 1840 by an ambitious British intelligence officer named Captain Arthur Conolly. He somewhat naively called it a great game, a noble game. But on the other side, the Russian diplomat Karl Nesselrode described it with a much darker, and honestly probably more accurate phrase, the Tournament of Shadows. Because that's what it was, an era where military intervention worked hand-in-hand with shadowy diplomatic intrigue.
Let's move into our first section, clashing imperial fears.
To really grasp why these two heavyweights collided so fiercely, we gotta look at the deeply rooted paranoia driving both empires. For Britain, their foreign policy was dominated by one absolute, overwhelming fear, protecting their prized jewel in the crown, which was India. They felt they had to establish friendly buffer states to keep Russia at arm's length, while simultaneously expanding free trade using new steam-powered riverboats and railroads. Meanwhile, you have Russia expanding southward from Siberia. They're looking for secure frontiers, trying to protect their merchants from being enslaved by Central Asian khanates, and, crucially, making moves toward India, specifically to extort diplomatic concessions from Britain back in Europe.
And the seeds of this conflict were sown surprisingly early. Back in 1801, Tsar Paul actually ordered a joint force of Cossacks to literally march on India. It was a completely grotesque plan, especially considering he didn't even have maps extending past Khiva, but it absolutely terrified the British public. Fast forward over the next few decades, and Russia wins decisive wars against Qajar Iran, significantly weakening Persia through treaties in 1813 and 1828. Reacting to all this, in 1830, Britain officially kicks off its forward policy. They task Lord Bentinck with pushing trade routes north to Bukhara just to preempt Russian dominance. The pieces were now officially on the board.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Afghan Buffer.
Geographically speaking, the ultimate collision point for these expanding empires was the rugged terrain of Afghanistan, sitting right there directly between them. And that brings us to the absolutely pivotal year of 1838. Terrified by Russian diplomatic missions showing up in Kabul, Britain issued the Simla Manifesto. Now, this was essentially just a piece of propaganda justifying a massive invasion of Afghanistan to depose the ruling emir, Dost Muhammad Khan. Britain's goal? To install a puppet ruler who would share their progressive vision and act as a totally compliant buffer against Russia.
The local rulers caught in the middle of all this were understandably completely bewildered. When the deposed Afghan emir, Dost Muhammad Khan, surrendered, he perfectly captured the absurd scale of this imperial ambition. He just couldn't fathom why an empire with such vast ships and immense arsenals would cross rivers and mountains merely to claim his harsh, unforgiving territory. The answer, of course, was the game.
But, as you can imagine, trying to control Afghanistan proved to be incredibly bloody and volatile. In 1842, the British suffered one of the absolute greatest military disasters of the 19th century. Their entire Kabul garrison, we're talking 4,500 troops and 12,000 camp followers, was completely wiped out during a freezing winter retreat, literally, save for one single wounded doctor. Then, jump ahead to 1878. An uninvited Russian diplomatic mission arrives in Kabul, and boom, it sparks the Second Anglo-Afghan War. This time around, after some brutal fighting and a massacred British envoy, they reached a diplomatic settlement in 1880. Britain ultimately secured control over Afghanistan's foreign policy, finally getting their buffer state, but at a staggering cost in human lives.
Moving on to Section 3, drawing lines on maps.
Realizing that endlessly fighting these proxy wars in the mountains was just draining both empires, they eventually pivoted. They turned to the bureaucrats, the surveyors, and the map makers. Through this incredibly complex web of treaties, modern Afghanistan was meticulously constructed to be a sort of geopolitical shock absorber. In 1873, they used the Amu Darya River as a physical border.
Then, the 1879 Treaty of Gandamak gave Britain the foreign policy control they had bled for, and by 1895, the Premier Boundary Commission finalized the Wakhan Corridor. This is a fascinating geographical quirk, a long, finger-like eastern appendage given to Afghanistan for the sole, explicit purpose of making sure the British and Russian borders would never actually physically touch.
But drawing those lines wasn't always a peaceful process. Take the 1885 Panday incident, for example, which very nearly ignited an all-out global war. Russian forces pushed south, straight up annexing a district north of Herat. A small Afghan force of just 500 men tried to defend it, but they were entirely overwhelmed by vastly superior Russian numbers. And here is the kicker. Despite their treaty obligations, the British actually did not send military aid to the Afghans, knowing full well they couldn't win a land war there. This crisis forced a super urgent diplomatic settlement that permanently stripped territory away from the Afghans just to satisfy the Russian advances.
Next up, Section 4, Persia, Tibet, and beyond.
As the Great Game inevitably spilled outward into other sovereign territories, expanding the board, so to speak, the British Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston summed up the global mood perfectly. He said, snarling at each other, hating each other, but neither wishing for war. His words so beautifully illustrate the enduring paradox of the whole era. You had aggressive diplomatic posturing, literal spies in disguise, and constant military threats. But it was all carefully calculated to edge right up to the line without ever actually triggering a catastrophic superpower war. And this snarling competition even reached the highest altitudes on Earth. Up in the Himalayas, Russian exploration by folks like Nikolai Przewalski, along with diplomatic links forged by a Russian-born monk named Agvan Dorjiev, really triggered intense British paranoia. The British were absolutely terrified that Russia was forming an alliance with the 13th Dalai Lama. So, in response, Britain decided they needed to forcefully buffer India from the northeast, which led directly to the 1904 Curzon military expedition that just forcefully pushed its way right into Lhasa, Tibet. While the empires clashed up in the Himalayas, to the west, Persia was slowly being suffocated. It became this incredibly tragic proxy battleground where its sovereignty was just eroded from all sides. Russia dominated it territorially up in the north, even establishing the Persian Cossack Brigade in 1879. That gave Russian officers massive influence over the Shah's own military. Down south, the British pushed back with intense financial pressure. This rivalry was so toxic, you guys, that both empires mutually blocked the construction of railroads in Iran. They deliberately stalled the country's industrialization just to deny each other a strategic advantage. And by 1908, Russian troops were directly intervening to crush the Persian constitutional revolution.
Which brings us to our final section, the legacy of the Great Game. So how did this massive, unyielding imperial pressure cooker, one that stretched all the way from the Caucasus to Tibet, finally come to an end? Well, it took an entirely new external fear to force a truce: the rapidly militarizing German Empire. The sudden rise of this huge mutual threat over in Europe finally forced Britain and Russia to the negotiating table. The 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention officially closed the tournament. They formally carved Iran into northern and southern spheres of influence. Britain recognized Russia's hold on Central Asia. Russia finally backed off Afghanistan, and Tibet was declared a neutral territory. Basically, they stopped fighting each other in Asia so they could prepare for World War I.
But here's the thing, the consequences didn't just disappear when the ink dried on those treaties. The enduring legacy of this era is physically visible on any map you look at today. The borders drawn by those 19th century British and Russian bureaucrats, lines that often cut straight through tribal lands and natural geographies, they continue to shape the geopolitical realities, the national identities, and the regional conflicts of our modern world. I mean, the Wakhan Corridor still exists exactly where those empires mandated it over a century ago.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating and maybe somewhat haunting final thought. Given the lasting impact of these borders and the ongoing competition for influence in Central Asia by modern superpowers today, we really have to ask, did the game actually finish in 1907, or did the players simply change? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope it gave you a solid new perspective on exactly how the maps of our world came to be.